My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and having completed my 3 series on Peter Jackson's movies, where I looked at things that just make no sense, things that he got right, and then just interesting details that he kind of changed or snuck in there that you wouldn't notice if you weren't a reader, I wanted to talk about why Peter Jackson's movies are so successful. And I don't mean successful in a financial sense. I don't mean why they are good cinema merely. What I mean specifically here is why are they so successful at winning over dedicated fans of the books when he did so many things to undercut, undermine, and just twist the original source material in his movies. Now, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me a little bit here because, especially ever since The Rings of Power came out, people defend Peter Jackson like he's not exactly on a pedestal, but basically people will make arguments like Rings of Power completely trashes the canon. Peter Jackson made a few changes here and there, but he kept to the spirit of the story. And I would disagree with that because I really don't think Peter Jackson kept with the spirit of the story except in very small areas. It's more the exception than the rule, actually. And just to give some examples, look at characters. Frodo is a bit of a passive person compared to the book. Aragorn is a reluctant hero, and he's not in the book. Denethor turns into basically a crazy madman for the entire story, whereas that's really not true in the book. He turns Faramir's character on his head because he makes Faramir just like everybody else and doesn't reject the ring. Boromir's mostly okay. Samwise is mostly okay. Legolas and Gimli are completely flipped in terms of who they are in the book. And those are just characters. You could look at events, too. Weathertop, for instance, and this is one of the ones that I find particularly annoying. Weathertop, Aragorn is in favor of lighting a fire. Sam objects because he's worried about being found. And they totally flip that around in the movie to everybody starts a fire while Frodo's asleep. He wakes up and thinks they're idiots. You know, you got stuff like this all throughout the story. Like, the major events that happen are all kind of there, but how they happen and why they happen end up getting completely flipped. You know, a lot of what happens in Rohan ends up being very different than the book. Some of these things are perfectly excusable in terms of, well, we need to save time, we need to have, we can't put everything from the book into the movie or it'd be way too long, it's already really long as it is. There's tons of rationales you can give for a lot of these things, but not for all of them. You can't rationalize all these character changes based on saving time. For instance, Faramir, actually, if you made him like he was in the book, would have saved time in the movie because then he wouldn't have dragged Frodo and Sam all the way to Osgiliath before letting them go. There's tons and tons and tons of things in these movies that undermine or twist or whatever the original story in ways that are kind of egregious and definitely unnecessary. So I really don't buy this whole idea that Peter Jackson is actually keeping the spirit of the story, because what do you mean by the spirit of the story at that point? Like, if all you mean by the spirit of the story is good guys fight bad guys against overwhelming odds and win through, not being power-hungry maniacs, okay, but that's cutting it down to a very narrow little thing that, the story is about so much more than just that. And it's true that, Peter Jackson does keep most of the morality of the original story and whatnot, but really most everything else is just wrong. It's just wrong. And I really don't, the longer I live and the more I reread and rewatch the book and the movies, the more I come to the conclusion that they're not very much alike at all. And yet I still really enjoy the movies, although I do enjoy them less than I used to for this reason. And there are lots of other people out there who are fans of the book who also still find the movies very enjoyable. Now, I will say, there are plenty of people out there, a smaller number, I think, but a large enough number to be worth noting, of people who immediately disliked and never liked the movies at all. And those are the people who kind of take what I'm saying now to the extreme of he's ruined the entire story, so it's not worth watching at all. And, that's not an invalid opinion. I'm not going to say that that's wrong. I do think it's maybe a little extreme in the sense that the movies are still good movies. And as I said, I'm not here talking about the success of the movies just as cinema, but it can't be denied that they are great cinema. I mean, they really just are. I mean, there's so much love and care put into almost every aspect of those movies that you can't ignore, and you have to admit they deserved a lot of Oscars because there was just a lot of work that went into that. All the time they spent putting together Chainmail by itself is just a testament to the love that these people had for their project. And you've got people like John Rhys Davies, who at the end of it, and still to this day, talks fondly of his experience because of the passion for the project. It wasn't just some, well, we're just going to see if we can make some money off this. No, they really cared. Now that's, one thing that makes it kind of funny to me is the fact that they cared so deeply about this project and yet changed so much. You would think the opposite would be the case. Like, either it was just a cash grab and that's why we don't care about changing the story, or we love the project so much and therefore we're going to make it really faithful to the original source material. Whatever the reason for that dichotomy is, the point I'm getting at here is the fact that it's such great cinema does play into why the trilogy is so successful in winning over dedicated, fans of the books. Because there is a certain amount of stuff that you can kind of just put up with, let's say, if the movie is just a good movie. I've talked about this before in my video, which got a lot of flack, about the idea that the reason you hate The Rings of Power is not because it violates canon. I made this point because the point is, yes, The Rings of Power violates canon. So does Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Over and over and over and over and over. But you're willing to put up with more of that if the movie or the show or whatever we're talking about is just really good on its own merits. And you're willing to, the better one part of something is, the more you're willing to overlook flaws in another area. That's just the case. You could, if you want to buy a car, just to take a completely random example, and all you care about is, the horsepower, you might be willing to put up with a lot of annoying features and even frequent, maintenance issues just because it's the fastest car on the market, if that's what you really care about. On the flip side, if you're like me and you really just care about reliability, you're willing to buy something that's cheap and has no bells and whistles, and some of those features or lack thereof may become annoying at certain points, but you're driving the same car for 20 years without really hardly any problems, and you're willing to overlook the fact that you don't have power windows. I'm speaking from experience. My car does not have power windows, but I'm still driving the same car that I have had for 16 years. So this is a general principle that applies to all kinds of things, and it also applies to movies. You might be willing to watch a movie merely because it has Tom Cruise and overlook the fact that the plot's a little goofy and some of the other actors are not up to par, but you just really like Tom Cruise. And I'm just picking Tom Cruise out of the ether because he's, one of the more prominent actors who's been around for forever at this point. But it might be something else about the movie. It might be that you just really love fantasy and you're willing to watch any fantasy movie just for that aspect of it. And an example of this might be the Highlander movie, the original one. They're making a new one, which I'm hoping will be a really good example of what people should have been doing for a long time now, which is remaking not-so-great movies into good movies. Because usually what happens is people go, oh, this movie made a lot of money way back when because it was really good. Let's remake it, and then they do it terribly, and they wonder why it bombs. It's like, well, stop remaking good movies that we've already got good versions of and remake one that was not that great and make it into a really good movie, and then you've got a winning formula. The original Highlander movie had its merits. And it has to be said, for the time that it was made, when fantasy movies were just kind of becoming a thing, it was pretty good for its time, but it's got acting issues, it's got pacing and plot issues. It's not a great movie by any metric, but it was made in the 1980s when there was not a lot of options for fantasy movies, and so it got a cult following because people who really liked fantasy and that whole idea of what if we had just a completely fantastical plot, they really bought into it because it was extremely interesting in that regard. And it spawned a TV series, a whole bunch of extra movies, and the next thing you know, they're doing things that are just really terrible in the movies. But there you go. Point being, you're willing to put up with a lot of bleh if you get more of something that's really, really awesome. The less of really, really awesome you have, the less bleh you're willing to put up with. So the fact that the Lord of the Rings trilogy is just really good cinema in its own right certainly helps the aspect of why the movies are so successful in terms of why they won over Lord of the Rings reading fans. And that is a huge element of it, I think, because you can tell, it really jumps off the screen just how much the people who worked on the project cared about it, because the details are everywhere. The fact that they use miniatures for big, huge things like Minas Tirith and Orthanc and all this stuff, the amount of love that went into crafting Smeagol, because the CGI in Smeagol has not really been exceeded even to this point. You can't find anything much better than that. It still is realistic enough to make you buy into the movie, whereas a lot of movies, that you might have looked at back in the day from just prior to, say, The Lord of the Rings that had CGI characters or whatever, you'd look at those and go, that's pretty good at the time. And then a few years later, the technology advances so much that you look back at that other movie and you go, man, how did I ever think this was good? It's kind of like playing Ocarina of Time when it was released and thinking, man, the graphics. And then, you after Twilight Princess and then, Breath of the Wild and all these other Zelda games come out and you go back to Ocarina of Time and you're like, ew, the polygons. It's that kind of thing. But this has not happened to Lord of the Rings. Everything still holds up. Now, that's not to say that it's perfect, because you can tell that things have progressed, and therefore some of the stuff in it is not quite as good as it could be now, but it's barely noticeable, and it's not noticeable with Gollum, for instance. And then you've got details that they point out in, the appendices to the extended editions. If you watch some of that stuff, and some of the details that they put into shields and armor, and all this stuff that doesn't even ever get shown on screen. But they did it because they wanted to make the world as real as possible, even for the actors. Which, let's face it, the more you can immerse your own actors into the story, the more realistic they're going to be in terms of their acting. So, there's all kinds of reasons why The Lord of the Rings is just great cinema. And let's face it, it's not just the detail in terms of making the production. They picked a lot of really good actors. Now, not all of them are great actors, but there's a lot of really good actors in that movie who filled their roles really well. Now, some people will complain, like, for instance, Elijah Wood. I've heard some people complain that he's not very good in his role. I think he's perfectly fine in his role. It's just that his role was not written as actual book Frodo. And maybe Elijah Wood wouldn't be as good at book Frodo as he was at movie Frodo. But, whether we want to nitpick on some of those, there's not a bad casting choice in the entire film. And there's plenty of good ones. And a good example of that is actually Faramir. David Wenham is usually a comedic actor, but they picked him for Faramir, who is anything but a comedic character, and it works extremely well. I think he was a great pick for Faramir. Unfortunately, they did his character dirty in the writing room, but, aside from that, he actually works really well and weirdly looks like he could be Sean Bean's brother. But anyway, there's tons of great acting choices. You know, John Noble is great as Denethor, even though they screwed up Denethor's character. There's tons of examples of this. Ian McKellen is great as Gandalf. Saruman is, I think you could not ever find anybody better than Christopher Lee to play Saruman. There's just tons of examples of this, and the acting, the detail, the everything about the movies was just extremely well made. And it can't be denied. I mean, there's a reason why The Return of the King won every Oscar it was nominated for, which, they kind of gypped the first two movies because they knew what was going to happen, and they didn't want to just give Lord of the Rings all the Oscars 3 years in a row, which is, political thinking, but whatever. But this is the kind of thing, and like I said, this is a huge chunk of why these movies were successful. I think another reason why the movies were so successful in appealing to book fans is that, one, everybody thought this was impossible. Nobody thought that a live-action Lord of the Rings could ever work. And after the several attempts at animated versions had been done, probably nobody thought that even an animated version could ever really be successful, because you had Ralph Bakshi's first movie, which was pretty good as it went, but it was very short and it lacked in a lot of departments. And then you had the follow-up with Rankin Bass doing Return of the King, which skipped a huge, when you put those two movies together, there's a huge chunk of the story that gets completely skipped. And Rankin Bass, for all its merits, has a lot of demerits too. It's a lot of its merits are exactly the kind of things that Bakshi's version doesn't have, and vice versa. So there's just a lot going on in the history of this whole idea that made everybody think that Lord of the Rings just can't be made into a movie. And then Peter Jackson came along and just did it. And one thing that I think his movies do successfully is show that the story can be adapted. Now, it's not perfect, and what I mean by that is the idea of the adaptation is not perfect, because certainly the movies themselves that were actually made are not perfect, but even conceptually, when you think about adapting the actual story and putting that on the screen, that still is not quite what you would want it to be. Because think of all the things that you would have to adapt to make a truly faithful adaptation of the books. Think of all the songs that get sung. Think of Tom Bombadil. There's just a ton of stuff that if you really wanted to faithfully adapt the books, some of it would be kind of out of place in a cinematic experience. And that's not to say that I would complain about it, because let me tell you, I'm here for a 100% faithful, long series or mini-series adapting the Lord of the Rings page for page. Even though some of it will be maybe a little bit weird, I'm here for it. But for movie-going audiences generally, it won't work. And that's, part of the thing. It's like you have to make the movie successful enough to appeal to broad audiences, not just the teeny little niche who really want the 100% faithful adaptation. Because if you can't do that, the movie studio can't make back its money, and then, they have to make money. You just have to account for that. So there is a certain extent to which you can't do that for those reasons, and that's why I say conceptually the really faithful adaptation doesn't work. You do have to leave some things out. You do have to modify some things to make it adaptable as a financially successful enterprise. So there are limits. There really are. Now, that's not to say, again, that I think that some of this stuff would be bad. I think if you did it right, 100% faithful adaptation would actually be good in virtually all ways, although there are a handful of things that would probably be like, that doesn't work quite so well in a film. And there are certainly aspects of the idea that you cannot grasp, let's say, some of the what seems to be, at least, third-party omniscient narration that you get in the book. You don't get a whole lot of those. But you do get moments like that, and there are, other things in the book where it's not even necessarily third-party omniscient, but there's definitely a narrator telling parts of the story, and it seems like some of those are probably not ever really going to fully translate to cinema, because to make that happen, you would have to have some disembodied voice narrating for parts of the story. It could be done, but I think it would not jive well with a really faithful adaptation overall. Now, it has been done because Ralph Bakshi has, his version actually has a little bit of narration. I remember specifically at the Council of Elrond, and also in between Bilbo's party and when Gandalf returns to talk to Frodo, and there may have been a couple other spots. There's some narration that goes on, and so it's not impossible, but when you start doing it enough to incorporate all the points in the book where this happens, it starts to probably get a little weird. And I think this applies whether it's animated or live action. Back to my main point, though. So everybody thought this was impossible, and especially that a live action was impossible. And the fact that Peter Jackson actually did it and didn't completely wreck it, because that's what people were afraid of, is that, if you made this movie, people are just going to make it terrible. It's like, no, actually, he did a really good job. It's a really great set of movies. Again, if you ignore the adaptation issues and the faithfulness to the original source material, overall, he did a great job. And even though he did go against the source material in a lot of ways, he still captured enough in terms of getting the basic story, timeline, points of, major events and going from here to there without doing some of the things that the earlier adaptations had done, that I think people were just overawed by, my goodness, he did it. He did this thing that nobody thought was possible. And so there's a sense in which that kind of shock factor also overcomes a lot of the problems, because it's also, the flip side of that is not only the shock factor, but also, well, we got a Lord of the Rings adaptation, and it's a really good set of movies, and we'll probably never get anything this good again. Not even close, probably. And that also plays into this idea of, well, it's the best we're going to get, so we might as well enjoy it, right? Because there's other things that you could say that about. There's movies that have been made that have adapted things that it's like, well, this is not a perfect adaptation, but it's pretty good, and at least now we have it on screen and we can watch it. Because, and this has kind of been my feeling about the Lord of the Rings trilogy for a long time, I don't enjoy the Lord of the Rings trilogy even so much as great movies in and of themselves anymore. There was a time when I did, but the more that I've come to recognize all the different adaptation problems, I've come to this position where my real enjoyment of them is, it's kind of a shorthand way of reading through the book really quickly being over the course of 12 hours, but, it would take me much more than that to read through the actual book. And so I have the enjoyment of reliving the story because I know in my head, this is wrong, here's how it actually happened. This is wrong, here's how it actually happened. I have that Platonic ideal in the back of my head, and so I can kind of like self-insert my image of what should be happening, and it just kind of as an imaginary aid, the movie gives me the visual. You know what I mean? So that's part of the way that I look at the movies at this stage, and I have for a long time. And I think probably, whether consciously or not, a lot of other people are doing the same thing. They're reliving the book in their heads to some extent, just with the movie as kind of a vehicle for doing that. Now, I don't think that's what everybody's doing. I'm not saying that everybody's doing the exact same thing I am, but there is, I think, an element of that in a lot of people's enjoyment of the movies, because what they are really enjoying, some people, is the original story that they are reminded of by the movie. And so all these things play into why the Lord of the Rings movies are so successful. You've got just a phenomenal production to begin with. You've got the fact that it was an amazing achievement that nobody thought was possible. You've got the fact that it gives us something as an adaptation of something that everybody wanted an adaptation of, even if they thought it was impossible. And it shows what is possible in potential, hypothetical, but probably never existing other adaptations. Ever since these movies came out, people have been talking about now we need like the 6-movie version that does everything, or the miniseries version that does everything, or, people have talked about, even adapting the Silmarillion. Adapting the Silmarillion would be an absolute chore. I don't think it would be impossible, but again, I think it would be such a niche audience that I don't know that it would be financially viable, so I don't know that it'll ever happen. But this is the kind of thing that these movies did. It gave people hope, actually, for, further and maybe even better adaptations down the road. It gave people just the sheer pleasure of seeing Middle-earth come to life in live action, which was just, and that's the other thing, too. For all the gripes that people have about New Zealand being the backdrop, and let's be fair, New Zealand is not a 100% accurate kind of representation of what Middle-earth looks like. Edoras is not that rocky. I mean, not Edoras. Rohan in general is not as rocky as they make it look like in, the movies. But it is definitely a lot of really gorgeous scenery. I mean, you could not ask for a better backdrop for a lot of scenes. The forests, the rivers, the mountains, there's just so much there that, just to look at is eye candy. It's just gorgeous. So you've got that going for it too. The whole, just the spectacle, especially seeing those things on the big screen. It's amazing. The fact, they actually made Hobbiton. They took a piece of land and they turned it into Hobbiton, which in and of itself is a really impressive but also very gratifying thing to look at, because people who had images of Hobbiton in their head and then saw the movies were like, yeah, that's it. So, there's just all these different elements, and, there's probably other reasons that we could give for why these movies appeal even to, book diehards, but I think those are kind of the main ones. The first and foremost is they are just really good movies, and it's hard to hate a good movie, even if it is a poor adaptation of what you were, hoping it would be, right? If I give you, for example, and this, leave aside the car analogy, let's say I go to an ice cream shop and I ask for cookies and cream, and instead you give me, a different flavor that's also really good, I might complain and be like, well, no, what I asked for is this, but am I going to taste it and be like, oh, that's disgusting because it's not what I wanted? No, I'm still going to enjoy it because it's still good ice cream. It's just not what I wanted. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with the whole analogy there, is the idea that the movies are so good that even though it's not what we asked for exactly, it's still delicious ice cream. It's still something really enjoyable. So there's that. There's, the aspect of just the shock of it, the fact that we got it at all, the hope that it gave us for future adaptations. Just take the Rings of Power. When those movies were announced, when it was announced, not movies, shows, when Amazon announced that it was going to be making these, and we all knew that the rights had been bought, there was a lot of excitement going around because we wanted more Middle-earth adaptations. Now, what we got, a lot of people were not happy with, but that's a different story. The point is, we were all still riding high off the hope that those movies gave us, even though we had the Hobbit trilogy in between, which might have kind of dampened that a little bit. But there was enough of the studio interference and all the other stories behind that most of us were willing to overlook the problems. But looking forward into the future, a lot of us were still very optimistic and hopeful about what does the future hold for adapting Middle-earth onto the screen. And So we were excited, a lot of us were, about, Amazon doing something really good. Because Amazon has put out good productions. It's put out some that weren't so great, and it's put out some that were really good. And unfortunately, Rings of Power just disappointed, but it's still a thing that after those movies came out, people were hopeful. Now, I think over time, people are less and less hopeful about future adaptations and really just want to leave it alone. But that sense of hope that we got from those movies really was a powerful thing. And that hope is a very strong and powerful emotion. And things that give you hope are things that you like. That's just the way the human psyche is. So the fact that it gave us that made us like those movies. I mean, there was just so many different things going into that. But those are my thoughts on why the Lord of the Rings movies were so successful. Can you think of other good reasons why people, even who are kind of purists like me, enjoy these movies that maybe I haven't mentioned? If you can, leave them in the comments below. Good to hear everybody's thoughts on this. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and share it around. Make sure you subscribe to catch all my future content. And if you're on YouTube, make sure to click the bell icon so that you don't miss any notifications. Also follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week. And make sure you check the description for other support and social links. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.